At 4:45 on a Thursday, Melissa from HR stepped into my office and said, "Emily, Derek needs 10 minutes." She said it too gently. Everyone on the executive floor knew the next morning was supposed to be the biggest one in company history. We were hours away from closing a $300 million acquisition. So when HR came for me at 4:45, I knew it was not a scheduling issue. My name is Emily Marquez. I was 41, and I had spent 11 years building lattice point robotics. I was Senior Director of Systems Architecture, which meant I was the person people called when the product claims had to be true, the numbers had to survive diligence, or a major client was about to walk. I was never the loudest person in the room. I was the one who actually knew how the company worked. Melissa led me to a glass conference room at the end of the hall. Derek Hallstrom, our CEO, was waiting inside. So was Owen Pike. That was the first bad sign. Owen had the stiff smile of a man who had already accepted something he did not earn. Derek stayed standing, palms on the table. "Emily," he said, "I'm going to keep this brief." There was a folder in front of my chair. My name was printed on the tab. Melissa had a pen ready. Derek started with the polished version. "As part of post-transaction restructuring, we've made the decision to eliminate your role. Not reduce. Not move. Eliminate." I sat down and looked at him. "Why now?" "This timeline best supports the company," he said. That was executive language for we waited until the moment you would be most useful and least protected. Then I saw the rest of the room. On the side table was an open laptop already logged into my system's dashboard. Next to it sat a thick binder labeled Integration Transition Lead, Owen Pike. Through the clear cover, I could see my architecture diagrams. That was when the firing stopped feeling like cost-cutting and became what it really was. They were not just removing me. They were replacing my name while still selling my work. Melissa slid the packet toward me. "This includes severance terms, benefits, and your access transition." I opened it. They were cutting off my access by end of day. They were canceling my unvested equity. They were stripping out my transaction bonus because I would not be employed at close. Derek kept talking in that smooth voice executives use when they want cruelty to sound strategic. "This is not a reflection of your contributions." I looked at Owen. He still would not meet my eyes. One page deeper, I found the sentence that changed everything. Buried in the paperwork was a broad certification asking me to confirm that all invention assignments, ownership matters, and intellectual property obligations between me and the company had already been fully resolved. I read it twice. Then I looked back at Derek. He gave me a small nod, like this was routine paperwork. It was not routine. It was rushed. Defensive. They were about to close the largest deal in company history, and they wanted the woman who built the core system to sign away any future argument on her way out. I signed only to confirm receipt. Nothing more. His jaw tightened. Melissa escorted me back to my office while I packed a cardboard box. No one spoke. A few people looked up and looked away. On the way to the elevator, I passed the boardroom. Through the glass, I caught one slide on the big screen. Proprietary Adaptive Routing Patent Family. That line sat under the valuation summary driving the premium on the deal. I stopped. That patent family started in my notebook, my test models, and the first provisional filing from our warehouse days. I knew every draft, every claim fight, every late-night call with outside counsel. And standing there with my office in a box, I realized something Derek clearly did not. The paperwork behind that patent family was not clean. By the time the elevator doors closed, I understood the real mistake they had made. Derek thought he had fired a quiet, technical woman no one would miss until Monday. What he had actually done was remove the one inventor who could prove the crown jewel in his $300 million deal was sitting on a broken ownership story. By the time I got home, the shock had burned off and something colder took its place. Pattern recognition. I put my box on the kitchen table, kicked off my heels, opened my laptop, and started building a timeline. That is what I do when something is wrong. I do not pace. I do not cry first. I sort. I line things up. I find where the lie begins. Within an hour, the firing looked even uglier than it had in that conference room. They had cut me the night before closing so I would miss the transaction bonus, lose leverage, and stay out of the last round of diligence questions. It was surgical. Derek did not want a scene. He wanted absence. At 6:08, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Priya, one of the only people in operations I still trusted. She sent a screenshot of an internal announcement draft that had not gone out yet. The headline read, "Leadership for the Next Chapter." Under Owen's photo was a sentence that made my jaw lock. Owen Pike, architect of the platform that made this acquisition possible, will lead integration going forward. I read it twice. Architect. Not rollout lead. Not transition lead. Architect. That was not sloppy wording. That was authorship theft in executive font. My role at Lattice Point had never been decorative. I designed the first working routing model. I wrote the early system logic with 2 engineers in a freezing warehouse office with bad lights and folding tables. I sat in every inventor interview with outside patent counsel when we filed the first provisional. I reviewed draft claims. I corrected language when lawyers described the system in ways that sounded clean on paper but failed in the real world. Back then, our servers crashed so often that counsel sometimes copied my personal email because company mail was unreliable. I had kept everything: dated notebooks, prototype screenshots, draft claims, markups, email threads that showed who contributed what and when. Not because I expected a war one day, because serious technical people keep records. Still, the part that hurt was not the paperwork. It was the years. I gave that company my 30s. I missed holidays. I canceled trips. I took calls in hospital waiting rooms. I let louder men present work I had built because I thought being essential would protect me. It did not protect me, and it made me easy to hide behind until the day they needed me gone. I opened an old patent folder and started comparing early filings to the language in recent deal materials. That was when the deeper betrayal came into focus. Somewhere over the last 2 years, the story had changed. The patent was no longer described as something we built in the early days. It was being described as something current leadership had formalized and scaled into defensible ownership. That kind of language sounds harmless if you do not speak corporate. I do. It means someone stole the foundation and gave themselves credit for putting glass on top of it. Then I found the file that changed the whole night. It was the first patent draft, clean, early, unpolished. My name was exactly where it should have been. I opened the later version used in the transaction materials. My name was gone. I leaned back in my kitchen chair and stared at both patent drafts side by side until the whole shape of it became impossible to ignore. The first filing was from the early warehouse days, before Lattice Point had polished branding, a real finance team, or stable payroll. Back then, we were still eating takeout over test rigs and hoping clients would believe our demos long enough for the system to stop breaking in front of them. That first provisional filing was built out of my routing logic, my test models, and the ugly little diagrams I drew by hand because I trusted my own notes more than anyone else's slides. Later, once the company was properly formed, I signed a formal assignment so the business could own that original filing. That part was normal. Startups do that all the time. The inventor creates something, the company gets the rights, and everyone moves forward. That was not the problem. The problem was what happened after the product got valuable. As our platform matured, legal filed a broader continuation patent. The claims were cleaner, bigger, and far more commercial. That was the version that mattered to buyers. That was the one showing up in the acquisition deck, the banker materials, and the diligence room. It was the polished version of the same engine I had built at the start, except now it had been dressed up as executive genius. I started reading line by line. The broader claims still depended on the core logic I created. The language had expanded, but the heart of it was the same system. Same routing structure, same adaptive prioritization model. Same framework I had been defending for years whenever sales tried to promise things the code could not actually do. Only now, the inventorship line had changed. My name had vanished. That matters more than most people realize. A patent is not just a fancy certificate on a wall. It is a legal claim over who invented what. If the wrong people are named, the patent can be challenged. If ownership around that patent is messy, serious buyers slow down fast because nobody wants to pay $300 million for a lawsuit wrapped in a ribbon. And that deal was not based on office culture, brand charm, or Derek's confidence in a tailored suit. It was based on one simple promise. Lattice Point owned protected technology nobody else could easily copy. If that promise cracked, the whole valuation cracked with it. At 7:31, I got a call from Aaron, a quiet guy in corporate development who owed me a favor from a client rescue 2 years earlier. He did not waste time. Torvent is obsessed with the patent family, he said. That's the center of the premium. They think it's the moat. The moat. That was the exact word Derek had used in a board prep meeting 6 months earlier, right before talking over me when I questioned how clean our ownership trail really was. I thanked Aaron, hung up, and stared at the screen for maybe 5 seconds. That was all I needed. This was no longer about a firing, a severance fight, or stolen credit inside the company. They had built a $300 million sale around an invention they tried to erase me from. And if I was right, they had done it while betting I would stay quiet long enough for the money to clear. At 7:48, I called the best patent litigator whose number I had. When she answered, I did not bother with small talk. I said, I think my company just tried to sell itself on an invention they removed me from. Naomi Chen met me over video at 8:20 that night, and within 30 seconds I understood why people were afraid of her, not because she was loud, because she was not. She listened the way surgeons cut, cleanly, without wasted motion. I gave her the compressed version first. Fired at 4:45, deal closing in the morning, separation packet with broad IP language, old draft with my name, new version without it. Executive replacement already sitting in my system's seat before my badge had cooled in HR's hand. Naomi did not react to the insult of it. She reacted to the structure. Good, she said after I finished. I almost laughed. Good? It's terrible for you, she said. It may be worse for them. Start with source documents. No speeches, no theories, just proof. That was exactly the language I needed. So we built it the way I build systems when something critical breaks. Source first, timeline second, pressure points third. I pulled out inventor notebooks with dated pages and margin notes from the early warehouse phase. I found architecture sketches with timestamps. I dug up prototype screenshots from old backups and commit records showing when the routing logic first became stable enough to demo. I pulled meeting invites with outside patent counsel. Then I found the draft claims and markups that showed how the later patent language had grown directly out of my original work. Naomi read fast. At one point, she leaned closer to the screen and said, "Keep going. This is good." Then it got uglier. Buried in an old email chain from months earlier was a message from Blake Mercer, our general counsel. It came right after I pushed back during a board prep session where Derek wanted to overstate product performance. Blake wrote to outside counsel asking whether inventorship could be streamlined to reflect current leadership structure. I read that line out loud once, slowly. Naomi's expression did not change. That, she said, is not something they want in front of a buyer. It was polished language for a dirty act. We did not rant online. We did not send angry texts. We did not threaten Derek or call anyone drunk on adrenaline. We did it the dangerous way, quietly, correctly, on paper. Naomi began drafting a complaint to correct inventorship and challenge the ownership story wrapped around the patent family. She also prepared notice language because the company was hours away from closing a sale, while representing that its core intellectual property was clean and fully controlled. While she drafted, I locked down every metadata trail I still had. I sent preservation notices for my personal records. I called Marcy, a former patent paralegal, who confirmed I had been present in the original inventor interviews. Then I called Ben, one of the engineers from the early days. He did not hedge. Owen led rollout, he told me. He did not invent the core logic. You did. That was enough. Somewhere after midnight, the anger in me changed shape, and I stopped feeling like a fired employee and started feeling like the one person in this story who understood exactly where the company was weakest. Timing was everything. Once the money moved, the leverage died. So we timed the filing to hit before the deal could close. Just before dawn, Naomi sent me the final complaint and exhibit list. I read every page, approved it, set my phone face down on the table, and looked out at a city still dark enough to lie. The men who had me walked out at 4:45 were probably asleep, thinking they had already won. They had no idea the paperwork that could stop their deal was finished before sunrise. By then it was somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, that strange hour when the whole city goes quiet and people with clean consciences are asleep. Derek and his people were not asleep, and they were still talking. That helped me more than they knew. At 12:43 a.m., Priya sent me another screenshot. It was from the internal town hall deck they planned to use after the deal closed. The title slide said, "Building the Next Chapter." Under it was a glossy photo of Derek shaking hands with someone from Torvant. A few slides later, there was Owen again, wearing that practiced half-smile. The caption under his headshot said he had led the invention-to-scale transition that positioned Lattice Point for strategic acquisition. I stared at those words for a long second. That was how theft works in corporate settings, not with ski masks, with polished captions and approved fonts. At 1:07, HR emailed me again. Melissa's tone had changed. It was no longer soft. And it was urgent in the careful way legal people get when they know a loose end is still breathing. She asked me to review the severance packet as soon as possible and sign before 8 a.m. so payroll, equity treatment, and transition items could be finalized without delay. The number they offered me was insulting, not because it was small, though it was, because it assumed I was the kind of person who could be bought for a fast signature and a clean exit. At the bottom was a non-disparagement clause so broad it practically wanted me to disappear from history. I did not answer. Then they made the mistake that mattered even more. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of Torvant's integration managers emailed asking to schedule a transition call with me later that day. That did not surprise me. Thus, several of our largest clients still routed high-risk escalations through my office. Not because I had the highest title, but because I was the one who could tell them the truth fast enough to keep them from leaving. I never got the chance to respond. 5 minutes later, Aaron forwarded me Derek's reply. Emily Marquez is no longer with the company and was not essential to the protected technology. Owen Pike will handle all integration matters going forward. I read that line twice, then forwarded it to Naomi without comment, because that one sentence touched every lie at once. The diligence responses had already told Torvant there were no material intellectual property disputes, no key person dependency issues, no known inventorship concerns, no meaningful risk around the patent family that justified the premium price. And now Derek had added another layer. He was telling the buyer I was non-essential while also erasing the woman who had built the underlying system and sat in the original patent process. He thought confidence could outrun paper. It cannot. The smartest thing I did that night was stay silent. Silence made arrogant people reckless. They mistook it for fear. They kept sending messages, updating decks, and building a record against themselves while imagining I was home staring at my severance payment. By sunrise, they thought they were hours away from a press release, executive payouts, and champagne in the boardroom. At almost the exact same moment, Naomi filed the complaint that would make every banker, board member, and buyer on that deal reopen the fine print. The filing went out just after dawn. Naomi served Lattice Point's counsel first. And then she sent formal notice to Torvant's legal team because the disputed patent family sat right in the center of the acquisition. We did not need a judge to rule before breakfast. We did not need some dramatic emergency order by 9 a.m. We only needed one thing to happen. We needed the buyer to understand that the asset supporting the price might not be clean. That was enough. At 9:12, Aaron called me again. Closing is paused, he said without even saying hello. I stood in my kitchen with coffee I had forgotten to drink. Paused how? Escrow release stalled. Torvant wants immediate clarification on patent reps and inventorship exposure. Bankers are losing their minds. He sounded half stunned, half impressed. That was the first real impact. Not gossip, not threats. Not Derek calling me names behind closed doors. Actual movement. Actual money freezing in place because the one thing they could not afford was uncertainty around the patent family they had sold as untouchable. By 9:30, the company-wide announcement still had not gone out. That told me everything. If the deal had closed cleanly, Derek would have blasted the news before the ink dried. He loved victory emails. He loved polished language about vision, alignment, and transformational growth. The silence meant somebody had yanked the brakes hard enough to throw people forward. Then the calls started. Derek called twice within 10 minutes. I let both go to voicemail. Blake Mercer called next. His voice was lower than usual, almost gentle. Emily, I think this may be an unfortunate misunderstanding. We'd like to discuss a practical solution. Practical. That was a funny word from a man who had tried to streamline inventorship. I did not answer him either. Melissa from HR sent a note asking whether I would be open to constructive resolution outside formal escalation. I ignored that too. Then Owen texted me. I never wanted this to get out of hand. I stared at the screen, and for the first time since the firing, I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because that was the first honest sentence anyone from that building had sent me in months. At 10:18, Naomi forwarded me a request from the board's audit chair. Same-day special session. Immediate review of supporting documents. Torvant's counsel also wanted exhibits, timelines, and correspondence related to inventorship and ownership history. That mattered. Buyers do not panic because an employee is angry. They panic because a disputed patent can poison the legal promises behind a deal. If the company said the IP was clean, when legal already knew there was a problem, the issue was no longer personal. It was transactional. By late morning, people inside Lattice Point were texting each other in that clipped, unnatural corporate tone that only shows up when something expensive is breaking. Priya said the executive floor felt like a hospital corridor. Doors kept closing. Nobody was smiling. Even the assistants were whispering. At 1:40 that afternoon, Naomi and I walked into a conference suite downtown. I carried a banker's box full of original notebooks, printouts, and records. Nothing dramatic, just proof. Inside that room were the same men who had me walked out the night before. Only now they were not talking over me. They were sitting still, waiting for me to explain the disaster they had created. When I walked into that conference suite, nobody stood up. The night before, Derek Hallstrom had me escorted out like I was a risk to be managed. Now he sat at the far end of the table with his hands clasped too tightly, trying to look calm. Blake Mercer was beside him with a legal pad he had barely touched. Owen sat one chair over, pale and stiff. 2 board members were there in person. Torvant's lead counsel and 1 deal executive were on video. Naomi took the seat beside me, laid out our folders, and nodded once. Derek opened first. "This is an unfortunate reaction to a personnel decision," he said. "Emily was informed of a restructuring change yesterday, and by this morning she had escalated a claim in a way that is clearly emotional and disruptive." He said emotional like it explained everything. I looked at the audit chair. "I'd rather start with dates." She nodded. "Please do." So I did. I opened the first notebook and walked them through the original routing model, the early architecture sketches, and the dated entries that matched the first provisional filing. Then I showed the inventor interview emails from outside patent counsel. My name was on them as the person answering the technical questions the claims depended on. Then I laid out the draft claims: early version, marked up version, later continuation language. "This broader patent is not a new invention," I said. "It is a stronger legal wrapper around the same core system. If you remove the wrong inventor from that chain, the patent becomes vulnerable. If the patent becomes vulnerable, the ownership story in the deal becomes vulnerable too." Torvant's counsel leaned forward. "And your position is that this was known internally before signing?" Naomi answered by sliding a printed email across the table. The room went quiet. The message was from Blake Mercer to outside counsel. In it, he asked whether inventorship could be streamlined to reflect current leadership narrative after I had challenged a board deck that overstated system performance. One board member looked at Blake. "What exactly does that mean?" He cleared his throat. It was a discussion about presentation consistency. Naomi said, "Inventorship is not a branding exercise." Torvant's counsel asked the next question. "Then why did the company certify there were no known inventorship issues?" Derek cut in. "Because there were no material issues. Emily's role had evolved. Owen led commercialization." "Owen led rollout," I said. "Optimization is not invention. Integration is not authorship. Managing a team does not put your name into my notebook in 2015. The Torvant executive spoke up. "Mr. Pike, did you create the underlying adaptive routing logic?" Owen swallowed. "I led the team that scaled it." "That wasn't the question," the audit chair said. He froze, then said very quietly, "No." That was the moment the room broke. One board member turned to Derek. "You fired her last night?" He shifted in his chair. Her role was being transitioned. "The evening before closing?" He did not answer. The audit chair looked at Naomi. What happens if this proceeds?" Naomi kept her voice flat. "At minimum, you have a live inventorship dispute tied to your core patent family, conflicting internal correspondence, and transaction representations that may no longer be reliable." Torvant's counsel closed his folder. "Under current conditions, our client cannot close." Derek finally cracked. "This is absurd. We are not letting a terminated employee hold a signed deal hostage." The audit chair turned to him. "No, Derek. What we are not doing is closing a $300 million transaction while the inventor you removed is sitting here with documents your own legal team cannot explain." Then she asked him to step out. He actually laughed at first, but the second board member was already calling internal IT and security. Blake went white. Owen looked like he wanted to disappear. As Derek reached for his laptop, the audit chair stopped him. "Leave it," she said. "You are not to access company systems until further notice." And just like that, the same man who had me escorted out at 4:45 was being told not to touch his own computer. The deal never closed. Once Torvant froze the transaction, everything Derek had built his image around started collapsing under its own weight. The board launched an internal investigation within days. Outside counsel was brought in, email archives were pulled, diligence responses were reviewed, old patent files were reopened by people who were suddenly much less interested in protecting executive egos and much more interested in protecting themselves. Derek was removed as CEO before the end of the month, and the official statement used the usual clean language about leadership transition and governance priorities. But inside the company, nobody was confused about what had happened. He had tried to sell certainty built on a story he could not support. He had treated inventorship like branding, legal disclosures like decoration, and me like an employee he could erase before breakfast. Blake Mercer resigned 2 weeks later. Once that email about current leadership narrative was in circulation, every polished sentence he had ever used started looking dirty. Owen lasted a little longer, but only because men like Owen are useful shields. Once the corrected record started moving through council, the inventor image built around him fell apart fast. He exited quietly with no announcement anyone cared about. My lawsuit did not turn into some fantasy where a judge banged a gavel and everybody applauded. Real leverage is colder than that. It forces truth into the open and makes lies expensive. That is what happened here. The company settled. The settlement corrected inventorship on the disputed patent family, restored compensation they had tried to cut me out of, accelerated equity treatment connected to the transaction, and paid damages for the harm caused by the false narrative they built around my work. But the part that mattered most was not the number. It was the record. They had to stop pretending I was optional. Months later, after the governance cleanup and corrected patent filings were underway, Torvant came back to the table. Only this time the number was nowhere near 300 million. Once the clean myth was gone, so was a huge part of the premium. Buyers pay more for certainty. Derek had destroyed that. The same board members who ignored the quiet technical woman in the room now had to explain why the company was worth so much less after the truth came out. People asked if I went back. No. I had no interest in returning to a building that only respected me after it became expensive not to. I left with my name restored, my equity protected, and my reputation stronger than it had ever been while I worked there. 2 engineers from the early days reached out a few weeks later. Both had watched the whole thing unfold. We started a small advisory firm together, nothing flashy. Just hard technical diligence, systems risk review, and the kind of operational truth companies usually ignore until it costs them millions. A few months after the settlement, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a corrected patent plaque. Mine came wrapped in too much foam, like they thought extra padding could make up for what they had tried to do. I took it out, set it on my desk, and looked at the line under the patent title. My name was back where it had always belonged. That was the part I kept staring at. Not because I needed the plaque. I did not. I already knew what I built. But because the people who took my badge, my parking pass, and my title the night before their biggest deal had been forced to put my name back onto the asset they tried to sell without me. They fired me at 4:45 p.m. to make me disappear before morning. By sunrise, I was the reason their deal stopped cold.